quick peace talks on Ukraine are just not on the table right now. Russia simply doesn't want them. That's a fact. So Ukraine needs to act strategically. A solid war strategy, clear steps for defense and victory, resilience against Russian information attacks, and of course a steady supply of weapons from our partners. Joining us now is retired Australian General Mick Ryan, a military strategist who keeps a close eye on the war in Ukraine, writes books about it, and consistently advocates for more support for our country within the Australian government. It's an honor to have you here, Mr. Ryan.
It's great to be with you again. It's good to see you.
It's a pleasure to see you again. So recently, you visited Ukraine for the 5th time. And honestly, your dedication means a lot to us. You've had meetings with the top military leadership, including Kirill Budanov, as far as I understood, Chief of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. And in your recent video report I saw on social media, you mentioned visiting not only Kyiv, but also Kharkiv, Izium, Liman, Kramatorsk. And your main focus was to study changes in military technologies. What new insights you have gained from this war that were previously unseen?
Well, I think this war changes very quickly. We've seen learning and adaptation take place not just in the use of drones, but shooting down drones, in detecting and shooting down Shahed drones, more importantly. Those two areas around drones and counter-drones are moving so very quickly, and Ukraine is doing this faster than anyone else in the world. It's amazing just how quickly Ukrainian innovation is being deployed, not just to the battlefield, but to defend towns and cities across Ukraine against Shahed drones.
And how will this insight, you told me, impact the global military industry? Is it already affecting the global military industry?
Yeah, I think so. You're seeing a lot of countries looking at how Ukraine is using drones, developing their own. I'm sure there's many countries, if it was legal to export drones from Ukraine, would buy them from Ukraine, and hopefully one day we can. But also the tactics of using drones and using them in collaboration with ground forces, with artillery and with other air defences. We're all looking at that. We're all learning from it, and we're all looking at what do our militaries need to do to look more like the Ukrainian armed forces.
So do you see any signs that other countries producing more weapon, not just to sell it, but for themselves, reflecting on Russia's war in Ukraine?
Absolutely. Not just drones, but artillery and other weapon systems. Countries like Britain, Germany, France, United States, even Australia are stepping up production of their own indigenous material and munitions so they can assure themselves of supply. That's one of the things that Ukraine has worked very hard of, is that it can supply itself with drones and munitions to a degree now that it just couldn't do 3 years ago. That has been a stunning achievement and something that many of us would like to replicate.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good point, and we will come back to it. But not only once you are pointing on the speaking of deep strikes into Russia. So which one of those that Ukraine is doing you consider the most successful?
Well, I think the more recent strikes against munitions depots, not just the one in the last couple of weeks against Engels 2, but there have been previous strikes on munitions depots, are probably some of the more effective ones, because what it does, it stops Russia firing missiles at drones at Ukraine and killing Ukrainian people. And every life saved through those strikes is very, very important indeed to the Ukrainian government and to the country more broadly. I also think the strikes against oil infrastructure are important. Ukraine, by some measures, a recent report issued has, destroyed, tens of billions of dollars worth of oil infrastructure and oil for Russia. That's money that Russia can't spend on its war effort. That's also very important.
So you as a strategist, would you like to see more of such Ukrainian attacks deeper into Russian territory?
Well, I think Ukraine should make Russia hurt to come to the negotiating table. I mean, Russia has imposed an enormous amount of death and destruction on Ukraine. Ukraine has done nothing like that towards Russia. But there's nothing wrong with Ukraine destroying more air bases, more oil facilities, more munitions facilities. That's all legal within the laws of war, and it all hurts Russia. And that's a good thing from a Ukrainian perspective, and hopefully force Russia to the negotiating table and negotiate a peace that's acceptable to Ukraine and is just.
Yeah, I saw on your in your social media, you reposted a very good resource on that topic by Radio Liberty, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. Very deep and very interesting to, just to understand, the global picture of Ukrainian attacks into Russian territories. You've mentioned more than once that Ukrainian drones are highly advanced. And are you more impressed by their technical capabilities or by the ingenuity of Ukrainians? Why I'm talking about that? Because, Mr. Ryan, what's inside of the drones, it's just, part of that, part of something from China, all the equipment, it's not that complicated. That's what I hear from, our own military. So what impressed you that much?
Well, it's actually more complicated than that. Ukraine has now started building drones that are entirely sourced from Ukrainian components, which is an extraordinary achievement for any country in the world. But it's not just the mechanical elements of the drone, it's the software that is constantly being updated to protect them against jamming and to do more autonomous targeting. But there's also the planning that goes with the use of them. They have to plan how they can penetrate Russian air defences. And there's a whole lot of tactics about how drones are used with different elements of the ground forces, with artillery, and in longer range strike activities. It's more than just the mechanics of the drones. There's a lot that goes into successful employment of drones. And there's a lot of techniques that Ukraine has pioneered that many of us are watching with admiration and hope to copy in the near future.
I've just recently have spoken to our Ukrainian drone operators, and and they know that we had a previous conversation with you, and they following you on social media. So what they are saying that they have an impression that Russia somehow outpacing Ukraine in terms of drone tactics. Is it just a matter of having more drones or something else?
I think what Russia is doing, it's not as innovative in many respects, but what it does is follow what Ukraine does very quickly. It's what they call in the innovation ecosystem a fast follower. The problem is it can build things much more quickly to larger numbers just because of the size of its industry. But, Ukraine's drone industry is building. It constructed 1.5 million last year. It'll build around 4 million this year. That is a fairly significant achievement. But, the Russians are learning very quickly. Over the course of this year, they've learned to adapt better than what they could 3 years ago. And the more they do that and the quicker they get at learning, the bigger the problem that is, not just for Ukraine, but for other countries in Europe in the future as well.
So for us, it's the main task right now always to be one step ahead. In that case,
absolutely. Whether it's drone, whether it's combat tactics for ground forces, whether it's maritime tactics for the amazing steps forward in drone operations by the Ukrainian Navy, whether it's air defence operations, if Ukraine can stay just one step ahead of Russia in all those things, that will give it a significant advantage.
Yeah, and over the past year, especially on the Donetsk front, Russia has significantly changed its tactics, and I probably that, of course. All their relatively large advances seems to be due to massive mid-grinder assaults. Do you think this is linked to a shortage of artillery shells? That's what I think. Or is this trade-off of using mobilized troops instead of firepower actually helping them to capture more of Ukrainian territory?
Yeah, the Russians have changed their tactics several times in the last year. There's an adaptation cycle that sees them change every second month with their tactics. Fortunately, the Ukrainian ground forces are pretty good at recognising changes and also adapting. But the Russian ability to take terrain over the last year has been due to primarily a disparity in the availability of manpower. The Russians are able to mobilise more people, and to be quite frank, they don't care about their people like Ukraine cares about its people. When Ukraine cares about every single soldier, Russia does not. And it's happy to waste them in these meat assaults. I think the disparity in artillery that we saw a year ago is no longer there. Ukraine has, been able to even that score. There's not a huge disparity in drone operations. The big difference is in manpower availability.
Yes. Just a few days ago, Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, he shared as him an image of the latest Ukrainian naval drone, Katran. What can you say about it? How will it change the situation at sea for us?
Well, I only know what's been released publicly by the minister. I did monitor that when it was released. I think it's a very impressive piece of technology. It will be an impressive and useful complement to the already wide array of uncrewed naval vessels that the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian technology industry has developed over the last couple of years. I guess we'll wait and see just what happens with peace talks about operations in the Black Sea, but it will add to the capability to deny large swathes of the Black Sea to the Russian Black Sea fleet. And frankly, it's the kind of capability that countries like Australia, Taiwan, and those with large coastal regions will be looking at to procure for their own systems to deny large authoritarian navies from impinging on their territory.
Okay, that's interesting. And the topic that everybody recently talking, it's another negotiations took place in Saudi Arabia between the USA and Russia, as well as the USA and Ukraine. And the Kremlin managed to somehow push its own vision of an energy ceasefire onto the United States. If it takes effect, Ukraine will be forced to abandon almost all targets the long-range drones have been successfully attacking recently. Why do you think the White House allows such behavior from Moscow?
Well, it's hard to tell why the White House appears to be aligning with the Russians on this issue. It's hard to read it any other way. Whether it's deliberate or not, the White House narrative is closely aligned with that of the brutal Russian dictatorship under Putin, not with the democracy in Ukraine. I would hate to see Ukraine put at a disadvantage just to please Putin. But that appears to be what is happening at the moment. But we can all be assured that Putin will break his word on this. I'd be very surprised if any ceasefires negotiated that they stick by, because the Russians, as you know better than anyone else in the world, never stick by these kind of bargains, and they will break them very soon.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mr. Ryan. So why do Russia actually needs all these negotiations? Do they give up of the idea not to capture Ukraine or destroy Ukrainian identity? No. So what do they need?
Well, they're just playing for time. I think what they're doing, they have not given up on their overall objective to subjugate Ukraine. That is still Putin's principal objective. I think what they're doing is just stringing the United States along until the President of the United States and his national security team get sick of the process, and they're hoping that the United States will just walk away altogether and allow Russia to continue its brutal operations against the Ukrainian people. I think that is what Putin is after out of these negotiations. He doesn't want peace. His whole country is now geared up for war, and he wants to continue it until he can achieve what he wants to achieve. Fortunately, the Ukrainian people continue to stand in the way of him achieving that.
Yeah, and about that, don't you think we are just trapped geopolitically? No one, from one hand, there is a pressure from international partners for peace talks, while on the other, there is a real threat that Russia will use this time to strengthen its positions and continue aggression. How can we avoid falling into this trap?
Well, I think the relationship with European countries will be essential here. I mean, America is still a partner with Ukraine. I know the Ukrainian president has said he still wants a relationship with the US, and that would be wise. But the trust has been broken. I think you saw President Zelensky in France in the last 24 hours. The relationship with the EU, France, Britain, Germany, Poland, the Baltic countries is the key to Ukraine's future, notwithstanding a desire to have the Americans involved as well. I think we also need to contest this narrative out of the White House that Trump wants peace and to stop the killing. I mean, this is a comfortable narrative for the Americans, but no one wants peace more than the Ukrainian people. And to pretend otherwise, I think, is wrong. Ukraine wants peace more than anybody, but I don't think the Ukrainians want a bad peace because they know exactly what it's like to live under the boot of Russia.
But how do you consider the idea of creating the realistic to create something like NATO, but within other countries?
A NATO without the United States. Well, it's something that 3 months ago was not conceivable. I think now it's very conceivable. And whilst the Europeans would always prefer to have the Americans there, they may have to face the facts that the Americans may decide that they're not going to play a significant role in NATO, that Europe will need to command it, and Europe will need to significantly step up its defence production as well as expand the size of its military forces. Some of them have already started that process, but many of them remain laggards in that process.
Yeah. I wish they could be more, faster in that process, because those countries that are closer to Russia, they definitely understand the threat. And the far away you are.
Yes. Now, you've seen the Baltic countries, Scandinavian countries, Poland in particular, have moved very quickly, not just to support Ukraine, but to build up their own militaries and defence industries as well. But as you said, your proximity to the threat drives the size of your will. And I think the further you get from Ukraine, the greater the will is to invest in defence industry and expanding their militaries.
In our previous talk with you, you mentioned that there is a need for Ukraine to kill more Russians to break Putin's will. But is there a limit to the cost of victory for us, for Ukraine? Could this price become too high for us? How do we balance battlefield determination with human losses?
No, I think you're right. I mean, you'd only have that debate in Ukraine because Ukraine is a humane and democratic society. You would never hear that kind of question in Russia, where they don't care about their people or the Ukrainian people. So I think it's a good conversation to have. Unfortunately, wars are terrible, and it involves killing, and unfortunately involves the deaths of your own people. But, I think there would be many who suggest the price is already too high, given the tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and citizens who've died. But at the end of the day, as terrible as that price is, it would be much worse to be living under the heel of Russia, unfortunately.
And I have questions, probably not that smart, but I want to ask you. Do you think that the fact that both Ukraine and Russia came from their own past, from Soviet Union armies and all that, they know the same tactics, the same approach, do you think this is like the advantage for us or not?
Well, I think there was a common start in 1991, but Ukraine has changed a lot since then. So whilst you still have people who understand Soviet tactics and which have become Russian tactics, that's a good thing. You've also seen this process by which Ukraine has been slowly transitioning to NATO tactics and processes. But there's a third element in there which Russia doesn't have, will never have, and that's Ukrainian culture and history and traditions. And that's also part of the Ukrainian armed forces approach to war and looking after its people. And in many respects, Ukrainian culture is the special source, I think, that makes them such a determined and powerful military organisation.
So while we are developing, Russia just successfully copying?
Well, they do like to copy quickly, but they can't copy Ukrainian culture. They can't copy the value you place on human lives, and they can't copy the spirit of Ukrainian soldiers in defending their own territory.
Yeah. And you said that the Western armies are lagging behind in decision-making speed and the adoption of new technologies. Why do you think that is? Is that because they haven't faced war for the last 11 years as we did?
Absolutely. I think that's the principal reason. I mean, Ukraine is facing an existential threat, and that drives different ways of thinking and taking more risk. Western countries don't perceive that threat, even though they are a threat from Russia and China. But also, Western countries, since the end of the Cold War, have reduced the size of their defence industries. At the same time, they've increased the size of their bureaucracies, so they've slowed down decision-making about buying fewer munitions and weapons and building smaller military organisations. So an existential threat helps, but getting rid of bureaucracy and focusing on the problem at hand and doing things more quickly is something that Western militaries really need to fix very quickly.
Mr. Ryan, I don't want to be controversial, but do you think that the Third World War is something realistic to happen?
Well, I think a future historian might look back and say the Third World War has already commenced. I mean, this is a very significant conflict in Eastern Europe. You also have an ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and you have a very significant confrontation between China, Japan, the US and Taiwan in the Pacific. At some point, someone might look back and say, well, actually, the roots of a larger war began in 2014 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we need to have a mindset that we're already at war, because only with that mindset can we dedicate the right resources to ensuring it doesn't get any worse than it already is, or that it spreads further afield than what it already has.
Right. And the war is shifting right now somehow into the social media. All these TikToks, Facebook, lots of soldiers posting themselves. Does it help or hinders Ukrainians' cause? Is this entire digital space just a playing ground for the enemy to exploit?
Well, it's a bit of both. And there's a real balance to be had here. And it's very difficult for military leaders because, one, you want your soldiers to show off their achievements so their families, their country can see them, so other countries can be inspired by Ukraine and continue to support it. So it's important in that respect. At the same time, you don't want to be showing things that the enemy might be able to copy or exploit, whether it's drone tactics or things on the ground. And you don't want soldiers' families to be exposed to intimidation over social media from the Russians or the Iranians or North Koreans or Chinese information warfare people. So there's a very careful balance to be had. But social media remains important. The president of Ukraine is a very frequent user of it. I follow him, and millions of people around the world do. But we do have to guard against some of the perils as well.
Yeah, do you remember, of course you remember MH17 case, where a lot of analyzing, it helped the investigation. The social media helped a lot to understand who's behind something, so...
Yeah, it did. Bellingcat in particular did a very detailed
Absolutely.
Social media exploitation activity. It was partially due to their work that we knew where the missile launcher came from, what unit, when the Russians shipped it back over the border to hide it. So social media does have an important role to play if it's used wisely.
And the next question is from my friends from the front line. They wanted me to ask you, how would you act as a general if there is an operation to eliminate Putin?
Well, that's very interesting. I know the US has a law against assassinating foreign leaders, but, if there was an opportunity to be able to shift Putin along the mortal coil a little bit quicker, I'm sure that we'd have to consider that very carefully. I mean, I think Putin is behind this war, and even President Zelensky said in the last 24 hours that when he goes, the war will be over. I hope that's the case, but I doubt Putin is going to give us an opportunity to take a shot at him because, he's learnt over 25 years in power how to protect himself, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I've heard the information that Russia is going to fight in Ukraine at least till 2026. That's the plan, what I've heard. So if the war drags on for several more years, what strategic steps would you advise Ukraine to take to maintain the initiative on the battlefield, given Russia's evolving tactics and rapid adaptation?
Well, I think there's a few things that would have to happen there. One is, the leadership from the top of the country, from the president, needs to remain steadfast and to explain to both the Ukrainian people and to people overseas why it's important to continue defending against Russia. We've got to keep reinforcing that message. Ukrainian people will still want to hear that. So I think that's important. Secondly is maintain and build the relationship with countries that are supporting Ukraine. I mean, many countries in Europe are stepping up their aid. We've seen very significant aid packages announced by France and Germany in the past week, and they will need to continue. I think Ukraine will need to continue to address its mobilisation of manpower and have a look at, what is the best way to get the right number of men and women into the Ukrainian military. There have been challenges. I don't think there's any secret with that, but continue to work on that. And then continue to work on the best training, the best equipping and the best organising of Ukrainian soldiers so they can continue to defend their country on the ground, in the air and at sea.
And speaking about Ukrainian soldiers, you have met many of them, from commanders to regular troops. What has impressed you the most? Their optimism, fighting spirit, or perhaps fatigue and exhaustion? Is there a risk that a prolonged war might erode morale even in the most motivated units?
Even the most motivated units get fatigued and have bad days, and that's why you have friends around you as individuals or fellow units to kind of pat you on the back and say, hey, I know you're having a bad day, but we'll get through this together. The things that impress me about Ukrainian soldiers, there's a sense of humour there, even when things are bad. They are incredibly tough. I mean, there's this real toughness about Ukrainian soldiers as professionals, even those who've been only mobilised for the war. They act like professionals, and they're very good at coming up with innovative solutions on the battlefield, but also well back from the battlefield to work with industry and other units. So, there's so many things that have impressed me about Ukrainian soldiers over the past couple of years. And I just find it a very admirable organisation full of first-rate people that deserve the respect of armies around the world.
Yeah, and lots of those people in the army, they are mobilized. Do you think that they are from different type of professions? It kind of help, those kind of creativity you mentioned on the battlefield?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. And, multiple Ukrainian commanders have said to me, and I had this conversation, they said, with mobilised soldiers, we get people that we wouldn't get otherwise in the professional army. They think differently, they solve problems differently, and they bring a different level of technical expertise, whether it's drones or IT or other things. So, you're bringing in citizens from a wide range of professions, and it makes it a more diverse and a better organisation for coming up with creative solutions to the very, very tough problems that face soldiers on a day-to-day basis. And I guess the most important thing is that with an army of mobilised soldiers, you are truly representing your country in the armed forces, and that's important.
Yes. And, while Russia having allies like North Korea, Iran, China, how do you assess the risk that this anti-Western coalition, I would say, could grow stronger and shift the balance of power in Moscow's favor?
Well, it's certainly a concern. Those four countries have a community that shares lessons. It's a learning community. We've already seen Iran use Russian tactics in their second major missile attack on Israel. We've seen North Korea take back lessons on drones. It started to build drones. and make its missiles more accurate. That will concern Korea and the United States on the Korean Peninsula. And in many respects, those four countries have become what I'd call an arsenal of authoritarians. They are building a large number of munitions and drones, indeed outbuilding Western countries. So, their collaboration is a very deep concern for Western countries, and we need to be much better at working together to push back on their efforts to destroy democracy around the world.
Yeah. Mr. Ryan, my last question will be regarding mobilization. I know you're going to tell me it's not easy in every country, but still, what steps Ukraine can take in that direction to make mobilization better?
Well, basically, the system that Ukraine uses is going to have to be one that Ukraine develops, because there's no existing system anywhere in the world that is equal to the task that Ukraine has. I think that, there's going to potentially have to be a reconsideration of the age limit for conscription. I know the demography of Ukraine is very, very tough indeed, and that people have modelled it out, multiple decades. But there might have to be a consideration of dropping the age again, notwithstanding how controversial that might be. The training system, I spoke to the Deputy Commander of Ukraine's Ground Forces training. We need to help him with things like simulation, with stepping up training in foreign countries closer to Ukraine to get more people through training once they're recruited by the mobilisation system. So it's not just about mobilising people and bringing them in the front door. It's about helping the authorities responsible for training to be able to train as many people as quickly as possible.
But I think you were saying that we have quite a good training so far for the last months, for sure, no? That we have a very good system.
Yeah, it's certainly come a long way in the last 3 years, but there are still problems with the right number of instructors and trainers in training institutions, and things like simulation, which are very, very important in modern training regimes and can cut a lot of time and make training much more cheap. So when it comes to assistance from foreign countries, they're the kind of things that NATO might want to think about in the coming months.
Oh, wow. That's good news. Okay, Mr. Ryan, it was such a pleasure to have such esteemed